So over the summer, I took a course on open source intelligence analysis, and it was fascinating, and it was a wonderful way to sort of spend some of my grading time, where I would grade an essay and then I'd do a module in the training. But a lot of it focused on what I would consider tools and techniques, right? So here's different ways to do reverse image searches. Here's ways to pull metadata off of images. Here's ways to sort of cross-reference email addresses and try to drill down and figure out what's available with open source tools and websites that are designed to facilitate this. And again, it was fascinating, but it wasn't what I was necessarily looking for, which was a conversation about an open source intelligence methodology. And this is something that had been kind of on my radar after reading this RAND Corporation report about how to sort of build up open source intelligence as a more robust intelligence gathering and intelligence analysis structure to make it more central to how the United States intelligence community works with information. And the sort of takeaway was that we haven't really had a serious conversation about what tradecraft standards would look like around open source intelligence, which of course pinged for me, because one of the things I like to do with these videos is when people say, hey, here's sort of the next step we would need to take and maybe a gap that would be useful to fill, I like to sort of step forward into that gap and bring with me some of my work in political science and research methods to try to sort of suggest here's a path forward, or at least here's how social scientists might imagine a path forward. And so what I'd like to present today is my 4 principles for tradecraft around open source intelligence, and I'll kind of talk you through each of the 4, and maybe they're useful for folks. Not making a claim that this is a comprehensive list, but it's certainly, I think, a place to start and to get the ball rolling on developing tradecraft standards around open source intelligence. And so the first thing that I would push out to folks as principle number 1 is that information is not intelligence. That one of the things that I think has seductively led people astray in the field of information analytics over the last decade is the belief that if you have just the ability to get massive quantities of information pulled off the internet means that you have something useful. And that's actually not true. Information on its own doesn't actually do much for us. And this is something that the intelligence community has known for a long time, right? That intelligence is taking that information, right, and running it through, a process of organizing and classifying and structuring and then analyzing and creating meaning in the mind of the analyst about how these pieces fit together, how to work with them, what they can tell us, and then communicating that out to an audience that needs that kind of information, that kind of analysis in a way that they're actually able to receive, right? So what we're trying to get is intelligence, that final product that can be useful to a customer. We shouldn't assume that just because we're able to collect vast quantities of information off the internet, that's necessarily anything useful. Just because it's open source information doesn't mean that it facilitates open source intelligence. And I think that the ability to pull billions of tweets from the internet, the ability to use computers to analyze those and look for patterns and maybe even do direct translation, right? The fact that we can use computers to do information analysis on such a massive scale doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting intelligence out of that process. And so the end goal should always be getting intelligence rather than just getting information. So it may seem basic, but I've seen folks interested in big data go astray on this time and time again. And so I'm laying it out as a foundational standard for tradecraft around open source intelligence. A second principle is actually, I guess, 4, because I've said that all information exists in a larger context, and that larger context consists of what I'm going to call the 4 C's, because I think hopefully that'll make it easier to remember. One of those C's being culture, right? That information, particularly when we're thinking about information that's created online, is created within institutional constraints and boundaries, and created within cultural constraints and boundaries. And different formats, right, have their own rules. If you are writing an article for a newspaper, you are going to write in a very particular kind of way. You're going to structure your article, where you have a leading sentence that has the critical packet of information. And then as you go down, you're going to expand and provide additional detail so that at any point in the article people could stop reading, but it sort of draws people down who are maybe more interested in what's going on. There's very strict conventions around what the format looks like for that. Whereas if you compare that with Christmas letters, even when a journalist is writing a Christmas letters tend to have a positive, upbeat, do the rundown of every family member and, this optimism for the new year, maybe a little jokey, right? It's a very different kind of writing, but there are rules to it as well. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that every kind of information that you're pulling out of sort of the collective sort of milieu of the internet was created by somebody who's trying to follow these rules, whether they're doing it consciously or subconsciously. There were rules around what they were producing. We see that playing out in terms of the different cultures that emerge in different platforms, right? And so the kind of things that people post and how they post on Facebook is very different than how they post on Twitter. It's very different than how they post on Instagram. And so understanding those different cultural patterns and behaviors is critical to understanding the kind of information that you're getting off of them, and simply throwing it all into a blender and saying I have a billion data points, therefore I have knowledge, doesn't work without the understanding about the way that people tell jokes and riff off of each other on Twitter versus the way that everybody's sort of networked together and trying to play relatively nice on Facebook versus Instagram sort of performativeness. Being aware of the culture is really important. So first C, culture. Second C is catalyzing event, that it's worth recognizing that nobody creates open source information for analysts to download and analyze. That's not why people do anything. They're not trying to give you a resource. They're doing it for their own reasons, right? Somebody's producing this because it serves their purposes. They're responding to a specific situation. They're responding to a specific need. That's why this exists. And really the best example I've ever encountered around this phenomenon is I was working as a research assistant for a historian named Bob Gross, who wrote an amazing book called Minutemen and Their World about life in Concord, Massachusetts in sort of the revolutionary and post-revolutionary period. And in going through this, we found these abolitionist petitions that had been sent off from to Boston. And he said, "Oh, look at this! This is essentially a public opinion survey of who was supporting the abolitionist movement at different points in time over the course of a 40-year period." And I said, "Well, Bob, is that true?" And he said, "Well, yeah, definitely, because people who would be wanting to create these petitions would want to maximize the number of signatures, and therefore they would go around town and they would know who was supportive of the abolitionist movement, and so they'd essentially hit everybody, and maybe would miss one or two here and there, but this is a good picture of who is supporting the abolitionist movement in Concord, Massachusetts, at these different points in time." And so we initially began treating it like a quasi-public opinion survey, until Bob went back to Boston and actually saw the physical document and discovered that it was actually the tear out, the last page of the State Abolitionist Association's magazine. And these were not just sort of random people creating petitions. This was part of a statewide effort by the Abolitionist Society. And the petition encouraged people who were getting this magazine, who were oftentimes the head of the local abolitionist society in the community, to get all the members of the abolitionist society to sign it and then send it on to Boston. And what had initially seemed like a public opinion, survey of a community, which was capturing sort of everybody, ended up being basically a membership list of the hardest core of abolitionists in Concord, Massachusetts, the people who are members of the Abolitionist Society, which is a very different kind of thing. And while it would be nice if somebody had gone around and collected signatures of everybody who was supporting the abolitionist movement, in 1838, people don't do that. People don't create these kind of documents and records and information because it would be convenient for us later on. They create it for their own purposes and for their own reasons. And understanding the catalyzing event of the thing that you're looking at can be really essential to understanding what the heck it even is that you're looking at. Okay, so the first one is to understand the culture. The second one is to understand the catalyzing event. The third one is to understand the creator, right? Who is creating this, right? What's their bias? What's their motivation? If we're evaluating the information that they have, right? Do they have the access or the credibility or the reliability to be able to do this? This is really important. We've seen a lot of sort of telegram posts from people in Russia talking about what the experience of mobilization has been like for their spouses. And this has given us really an amazing window into Russia's ability to train and equip its soldiers for the operation in Ukraine. But it's worth recognizing that when people are posting this information out, they're not trying to provide us with a window into this, right? They're maybe grieving over the fact that their husband or brother or son is in this dangerous situation, and they're panicking, and maybe they're thinking through sort of the worst case scenario. Maybe they're magnifying or amplifying sort of the worst stories, the ones that really have them panicked or they're really worried about. Maybe they're trying to collect money, right? They're pushing this out so that people will send them money so they can buy equipment for their loved ones to get at the front. There's a lot of different motivations and reasons for engaging in this kind of posting that I think are worth at least understanding a little bit, and also understanding who they're posting to, right? People tend not to post really personal things out into the, well, actually, that's not true. People post personal things out into the void every day, a million times over, but it's worth thinking about who that person thinks they're posting to, right? Are they just shouting out into the void, or are they communicating to close friends and family? Are they trying to get the attention of journalists? Are they trying to draw attention to this, or are they just trying to process, their own emotions in real time? Understanding, again, where that person is coming from with that post, who they're trying to reach with it, helps us to understand what it's doing. Because again, you may withhold or share, you may magnify or tamp down a lot, depending upon your own motivations, your own intentions, and who you're working with. Okay, so we have culture, we have catalyzing event, we have the creator, and then lastly, we have censoring, or in this case, self-censoring. And I think it's really important to remember that if you are able to access information through open source channels and methods, that the creator of that information was likely aware that that information would be out there, that it would be circulating. And therefore, because human beings are strategic actors, people are going to think about the possible negative consequences that they might encounter from pushing that information out in that way, particularly if you're dealing with an authoritarian regime, particularly if you're dealing with a topic that's somewhat sensitive, particularly if you're dealing with something that's potentially criminal. People may be self-censoring to avoid that and thinking about how to do that in creative ways. So censoring isn't just don't post anything, or I don't post anything critical. It may be that people are responding with plays on words or jokes or memes. There's really some interesting kinds of ways around censorship and social media restrictions and monitoring in China that the Chinese people have used, where they'll play off different characters, or they'll play off of rhymes to try to signal things without maybe triggering some of the monitoring that takes place. The cultural boundaries around censoring can change very rapidly. People are oftentimes very sensitive to that, and being aware that what people are giving us online is not necessarily the whole truth is, I think, a really central and important principle. Now, this is not a revolutionary principle. Obviously, if you've ever spent any time on the internet, and if you've grown up in the digital world, you're aware that people are not always who they claim to be, or that people are guarded on the internet in ways that are different than when you interact with people in their everyday lives. But I think it's worth remembering that in this context, when we're talking about collecting information on maybe a more large scale or more systematic way. Principle 3, now we've run through our 4 C's. Principle 3 is about understanding the collection funnel. And this is something that, again, I think social scientists have been very aware of for a long time. But I want to kind of run through because I think it's particularly important when we're thinking about things you pull off the internet. This is Ken Boland's sort of way of thinking about how information gets filtered down for coding of liberal democracy in data sets. but it could also apply to, what people are, recording on their phones, and the viral content that we get to see, right? If we think about all the experiences that are out there, all the things that exist in the world, recorded and unrecorded, that's a massive, pile of data. Only a tiny chunk of that actually gets recorded. Maybe people are taking videos on their phones, they're taking pictures. Of that recorded pile of information, a subset of that is going to be accessible, right? That people are going to choose to put that information up on social media. And that's where the censoring comes in. That's where the culture and the institutional rules around information sharing comes in. That's where thinking about the audience comes in. There's every reason to believe that what people are sharing isn't necessarily a representative sample of what they've recorded. They're selecting that for very particular reasons of what's been maybe uploaded or made available, right? A subset of that is information that others are going to start sharing. A subset of that is it can actually go viral, and a tiny subset of that is what you're actually going to get by sort of monitoring social media or by looking for open source information. And at every stage of this process, that funnel sort of gets narrower and narrower, and you're getting a smaller and smaller chunk, and you're getting a smaller and smaller chunk that is less and less representative of the larger whole of information. And so I think it's really critical when we think about the kind of things that we are getting through social media to recognize how fundamentally unrepresentative that information oftentimes is of normal patterns, just because of each stage of that process. People are making decisions about what to magnify, what to amplify, what to push out, and that creates, by definition, a biased or non-representative picture of what's happening. And then my final principle is that open source information is drawn from an active battle space, that other states, other actors, corporations, non-governmental organizations, interest groups, networks of people are actively trying to shape how we think about the world through propaganda, through disinformation, through information campaigns, and that anybody who is using the internet is potentially a target of these information campaigns, of this propaganda, of this disinformation. And then the level of sophistication that goes into creating sort of these alternate realities online is really impressive in a terrifying sort of way, meaning that this is a potentially dangerous environment for the broader population because of the way that it's being manipulated and used by potentially hostile actors. But it's also makes it a really challenging environment in which to draw information, right? And that once we start pulling information from the internet as open source intelligence analysts and trying to work with that information in a reliable way, that becomes a channel in which hostile actors can engage in disinformation, can try to mislead or confuse or disguise or deny the truth from analysts. And so it's important to be aware of that, not just in terms of an active battle space with hostile states, but also companies are engaging this as well. It's a rigorous and dynamic and potentially dangerous environment in which to operate in terms of getting accurate, useful, helpful information from actors who may have every incentive to deny that kind of information to us. So I'm not sure that this is a fully comprehensive methodology for thinking about open source intelligence information, but I hope it does start a conversation. If there are principles that you think ought to be added to this list, I would certainly welcome them. I think this is a larger conversation that's going to be happening within the intelligence community in the years to come, and hopefully it at least gets the ball rolling for some of the things that I think we should be thinking about that maybe aren't solely unique to open source intelligence, but are maybe open source intelligence has different wrinkles or different applications or different things to be aware of related to these kind of principles of tradecraft.